It's a very warm welcome to all of you to the ORF. I'm very sorry that we are starting a bit late, but there was a traffic issue, as it happens sometimes. So I'm very happy that we actually have Dr. Andris Sprūds today with us. He is the director of the Latvian Institute of International Affairs and also a professor at Riga Stradins University for Political Affairs,
yes,
I assume.
Yes,
excellent. And also his colleague Sintija Broka, who is at the same institute, a researcher and focuses on security issues. And when we planned this event some weeks ago, not too long ago, we didn't know that there would be an escalation between Russia and the Ukraine, which is in many ways highlighting the precarious situation at the moment in Eastern Europe. So I expect that we will have a very interesting discussion. The Baltic states have been, in the last year, I would say, very active, and I'm also glad that the new Latvian ambassador could make it. And here in India, because I think you're celebrating 25 years of diplomatic relations with India, and I think the Baltic states are also bringing a very interesting perspective into the discussion here in India. And I'm also very glad that my colleague Nandan Unnikrishnan could join us. He is a distinguished fellow here at the ORF, and he has been working on Russia for a very long time, so he can bring in both an Indian perspective on Russia and the situation, and probably also a little bit of a Russian perspective. And I saw that the Russian embassy also sent one of the young diplomats, so very welcome. I think we're all looking forward to an interesting discussion. So we have to stop this here at 12:30, but since we are not such a big group, I think we have plenty of time for a discussion, and we'll start with Dr. Sprūds, and then you will probably add a little bit from a more security-oriented perspective. So over to you, Dr. Sprūds.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, Britta. Thank you for introducing, and of course, it's a pleasure to be in ORF. I started my year with Raisina Dialogues this year, so I finished with ORF. So it seems that it's very symbolic and symptomatic in many ways. So it means that exactly the Baltic-Indian relations are sort of intensifying as well. A few theses when I speak about the Baltic-Russian relations. And I will exactly throw some ideas so that we can have a discussion, not to have some kind of like a long presentation. I think the Baltic-Russia relations, even though you might look from the narrow angle, at the same time, I think that we must put them into some wider context. So namely, they are symptomatic for some wider framework. I remember that Carl Bildt back in the 1990s, he said, that Baltic-Russian relations, or how Russia treats the Baltic countries, it is a litmus test for Russian-Western relations. So, of course, now you might say it is like this, it is not like this. The Baltics have become the part of the west part of European Union, part of NATO, part of Euro-Atlantic community. Of course, there is some element of litmus test, but at the same time, so we are part of the Euro-Atlantic like-minded community. But anyway, I think they are symptomatic in terms of how we all adjust to post-colonial, post-imperial politics. I think there are some challenges on all sides in a sense. So it is not an easy process of adjustment, and I think India has experienced it, and still I think experiences. So it's a long generational sort of exercise. Then, of course, you might also say that it shows something about a general neighborhood, and it's not the Baltic countries are not in a neighborhood, but still, so on a outskirts of the Euro-Atlantic community and bordering Russia. And I think also Baltic Sea region is interesting because it is the region where Russia and EU and NATO sort of borders directly. So there is also the micro level, you can say, management of relationship. Wider context, of course, is instrumental. So on the one hand, it's about the Baltics, but you might say that source of insecurity, source of tension, it comes outside of the region. But at the same time, you experience, you can say that some elements of the tension, some elements of trajectory, some elements of course, quite intensive interaction between the Balts or the West and Russia, exactly in the region, in the Baltic Sea region in general. The wider context is instrumental. The conflict in Ukraine is back to headlines. And of course, I guess we can go into the details later on. I would assume this is an important development, unfortunate development as well. It shows that Ukraine and tensions in Ukraine, which we somehow a little bit been forgotten already about them. So they are coming back to the surface, and sort of the third front, Crimea, East Ukraine, and now we see that Azov Sea is becoming also sort of the source of turmoil. So of course this is quite a worrying developments. If you look at the general context again, so in 2018, Western-Russian relations, uneasy relationship, and you can see ups and downs. On the one hand, the Skripal case and diplomatic expulsions. On the other hand, you can say a World Cup with some Russia's soft power, and I think quite nice engagement, a mutual one. And then again, you see Azov, and it seems statements and tensions are back. So you see ups and downs, and it seems that it's like we are for this trajectory or American roller coaster for some time, and also it seems it will be in the future. On the Baltic-Russia relations. As a Jewish joke is saying, you know, the telegram has been received, and telegram says, start worrying, the news will follow. So there are, I would say, the three points and three news. Bad news, relatively bad news, and relatively good news. The bad news, in a sense, it is, of course, 2014. 2014, it's a benchmark. I repeat it from time to time. For us, at least for the Baltic countries, what happened in 2014, it's the end of post-historical nirvana. We thought the geopolitics ended, that great power ambitions have ended. It seems it's not the case. Yeah, so it's still a great power ambitions and power politics are back. I must say that it has not been always like the sort of worsening relationship, and this is a little bit of hope for the future as well. We have had ups and downs in the past as well. So 1990s troop withdrawal, pretty much okay, with some challenges, but it still went quite smoothly. Then at the end of 1990s, the Baltics and Russians, we had sort of already discussing even mutual sanctions, especially from Russian side. So they were sort of pretty much down. Then with Putin coming and sort of Putin's foreign policy revolution, actually Putin didn't object too much against NATO enlargement, and we became NATO members in 2002. And there was a honeymoon between the West and European Union. As Romano Prodi, then president of European Commission, was saying, you know, now our relations are so good as vodka with caviar. So it fits each other so very well. Then, of course, again, sort of it was not so good relationship, and Munich speech, and Georgia, and then Medvedev and modernization agenda, and our president visiting Moscow in 2010. So it's interesting that it's not so all the time sort of the same trajectory. So now we have 2014, very sort of worrying signs for the Baltic countries. For us, it's sort of ghosts of the past. Yeah, so that actually we should feel again insecure, and there is some elements of assertive revisionism. And then, of course, when we see exercises, military exercises like Zapad 2017, as we estimate around 100,000. So, of course, in our neighborhood, this, of course, sort of are worrying signs for the regions that basically we should think how to sort of defend and how to sustain our security and independence. Of course, additional element is with Russian-speaking population. There is a lot of Russian-speaking population or presence. We can discuss this. Of course, there is this triangle in a sense, the Baltic countries, minorities, and also Russia, which plays some role. And of course, then this Crimea scenario sometimes, somehow, as it goes, they might appear, even though, of course, situations, in our understanding, it is quite different. What's, in a sense, bad news is that, to some extent, at this time, it seems we a little bit returned to the Cold War sort of ideas, Cold War mentality, Cold War approaches, Cold War psychology, and pretty much deterrence is on agenda. Good and bad news, but basically, of course, if we have to speak about unmanaged conflict or how we manage and manage conflict and how we start to compare, let's say, the current situation to the Cold War, of course, it is basically already not a good discussion. So it shows the atmosphere, environment of the mutual interaction. About so what is part and what is the reaction also within the deterrence? Of course, Baltics perceive that we need to defend ourselves. That now it's important also to contribute 2%. That we should sort of safeguard our independence because it is basically we live in a very unfavorable environment. Then, of course, we also see the strategic sort of elements like sanctions against Russia, and again after Azov, it seems there are some even additional discussions. But let's see how it develops with current developments as well. Relatively good news. Well, even though my Russian colleagues, we are organizing every year in Riga. It's, I think, a very good event, Riga Dialogue, where we have like close group of people with quite a number of Russians as well, and we cooperate very well with RIAC, Russian International Affairs Council, I think very respected institution. And my Russian friends, my Russian colleagues, they say, you know, when we speak about the dialogue between Western nations and Russia, then it's like reminds sort of the telephone call between a doctor and his patient, and doctor says, you know, there's basically bad news and even worse news to the patient, and patient asks, so what's the bad news? Bad news that you are terminally ill, that basically you are dying. Okay, so what could be the worst news? The worst news that we've been trying to reach you, and you will die in 3 days. Basically, you will die in 3 days. And then what's worst news? The worst news is that we've been trying to reach you for 3 days already, and we are not able to reach you. So basically, that already relations are not that good, but still, you never know what might happen as well in the future. So anyway, I think at the same time, there is some dialogue. There is some dialogue still between the West and NATO and Russia, and I think it's good that we discuss with each other, that there is also the EU or NATO-Russia Council, and ambassadors are still meeting, and there is still about some sort of element of transparency in military exercises as well in the region. I think we can speak where still things are going on in terms of connectivity. Yeah, so energy supplies, everything is pretty much fine. So even on European level, we discussed Nord Stream 2. There is a controversial approach in the Baltic countries with regard to Nord Stream 2, with additional energy, you can say, cooperation, but still the business, in a sense, goes on. In terms of transportation, so for instance, if we speak about the Baltic countries, or more specifically about Latvia, 70-80% of our transportation sort of shipments, it's still Russian. Yeah, so business is still moving forward. And you can even add India, especially China, that if we need to have some connectivity, of course, Russia is in many ways indispensable nation. So we cannot avoid Russia if we speak about some more Euro-Asian, more continental transportation corridors. So I think it is important. Some would say it would not be marriage in heaven, but it still could be marriage of interest, marriage of convenience, that Russia can be on the board in terms of infrastructure, in terms of connectivity, in terms of, you can say, economic interaction. Of course, what again Russian colleagues are saying, that it's also the trade, that there are some limitations, that there is some reorientation. It's not anymore from Vladivostok to Lisbon, it is from Shanghai to Kaliningrad. So there is a bit different kind of economic space, or at least how it is being perceived increasingly in Russia, and also the trade with Europe is decreasing. It was more than 50%, now it's less than 50%, already 40% approximately. So there are some, you can say, limitations. At the same time, still things are going on. The dialogue is still there, despite all the problems and difficulties on strategic element, on, I think, the fact that if we speak about the West in general and Russia, of course, we are sort of two different social animals as well. And of course, it's not easy with two different set of also interests. So it's not easy sort of also to interact. I think the good news have been in the whole process for us, the Baltic countries especially, is I think the West has been united. So far, so good. So the Euro-Atlantic community on sanctions, for instance, there has been a common position. And I am not happy about the sanctions, but I am happy that basically there are no divided signals. I think it's a good thing, and actually for both sides. It's good thing for the West, for the boats, but also I think it's a good thing for Russians that basically Russia receives quite a sort of united signals at least what can be done, what should be done, etc., etc. Even though, of course, always devil is in details. I think that I can stop here. I would say that no much light. I written no much light at the end of the tunnel. No, let's hope that it is not a light of incoming train, what we see in the tunnel. I think what we see is some kind of hybrid system, hybrid engagement as well. So some would say it's selective engagement as parlance in European Union goes, or I would say it is a sort of cooperative conflict, as some of my German friends have identified this, between the West and Russia, and also between the Baltic countries and Russia. So I stop here because I think we can discuss already later on some details. Thank you.
So thank you very much. That was actually a very good introduction, and I'll hand it over to Sintija now. It might be looking a bit different from a security angle, does it?
Thank you for having us here. Like director said, that this transatlantic relations and us being a part of NATO and being a part of European Union, of course, is making the region quite safe. If we are looking at the Black Sea region right now, so the Baltic Sea region or the Baltics are in a safe position. But still, even if the region is staying there, and even if the geography is not changing, still we have a lot of changeability in the region, meaning that not just the Baltic states, but whole Baltic Sea region in general. And the Baltic region is very closely related to the actions and dynamics in the whole Baltic Sea region, how I was mentioning, and this is known for everyone that most of the NATO member states actually is indeed showing on Russia as a possible threat for the whole region, and there's some things to underline why it is happening like that. One thing is that actually in the Baltic Sea region we have to combine deterrence and defense. And being apart from in NATO, where you have 29 member states, and of course to trying to develop, you have to face different kind of challenges, which is related to the investments, of course, which is related to the other cooperation and other relationships with the different kind of countries. The second thing is that actually Russia's attitude towards the region, Russia's attitude towards the Black Sea region is described as an aggressive pressure. So this is also something what we have to keep in mind, and we have to deter from one hand. And the power projections that Russia is also showing with this pressure thing. So these are the things which we have to keep in mind to keep the region safe. And apart from the things what actually is happening right now in the Ukraine, we still have another part of the region which is very important for the Baltic Sea region security, and this is the Arctic and the high north region up in the Sweden and up in the Norway, basically the Arctic region and the Norwegian territories in the Arctic. Just because we have a lot of Russian military concentrations in the region is one thing, and another thing is that Norwegian and Sweden are not benefiting from the NATO 5th article, so we have to find the ways how we protect our partners here, and how, because the NATO closed cooperation with the Sweden is seen as a threat for there, so we have to really keep an eye on this region in the high north, meaning. And then the second thing, of course, which we all know and we were already mentioning, was Ukraine, the Crimea's question, which is getting hot in the last few weeks. The Kerch Strait and Russia's involvement, and Russia's actually pressure on it again with these economic limitations right now by blocking the strait, and of course it comes together with the political willingness to change its position in the relationships with Ukraine and in the whole region in general. What I wanted to highlight is this North region and, of course, the Black Sea region, which is quite important for whole Baltic region in general in security there, so we can discuss it after.
Thank you very much. I think we have quite a good impression now how the situation is seen in the Baltics itself. Nandan, the relations between India and Russia are also in many ways in a flux, it seems. So how does India think about this at the moment?
Thank you. I think there were two excellent presentations preceding me. So there is very little that I can really add to it. All I can say is that to take the analogy further of the light at the end of the tunnel, there is this joke that, you know, an optimist sees light of the end of the tunnel and thinks it's the end of the tunnel. The pessimist sees the light of an oncoming train. And the driver of the train sees two idiots walking into the train. So I don't know where I stand. I probably am the latter one of the idiots. And therefore, I'll try and take the position of defending the Russians in this current context. Firstly, I will start with the Russian point, and then I will move into India's approach to the problem. I will start by saying that I do not think that today, and I'll be very brief, I do not think that today the Baltics have to worry about a military threat from Russia. I don't think Russia is capable of taking on the NATO, because if you believe that the West is resilient, then the NATO is part of the West. It's resilient, it'll respond. And I don't think the Russians have yet displayed that kind of suicidal tendency to want to fight a war with NATO. They will take countries which are close to NATO membership. They don't like the idea of NATO expanding closer to the borders. So therefore, you'll see this. Georgia is a good example. Ukraine, of course, is an excellent example of how Russia can create a situation that ensures that its security interests are more or less protected. But it is not as if the Baltics have nothing to worry about. I mean, I would consider that the Baltics are something that Russia considers as its natural sphere of influence, and they are amongst probably the most penetrated areas, penetrated by Russian interests. If you look at it, I mean, Russia is got, I think, very strong intelligence in the area. It is involved in the politics of the countries there, as well as in the businesses. If you look back in history, Latvia, in fact, was once upon a time considered the laundromat of Russian banks, and they were used to use Latvia to launder their money. In fact, I think one of the largest Latvian banks had to shut down. So, you know, these interests are very, I mean, it's too early to call it historical, but they are long-term, as it were. So they recently tried, if I am not mistaken, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think they tried to influence the Lithuanian elections, the presidential elections. They are also involved recently, particularly with Estonia. There have been several spy swaps, you know, so obviously their intelligence activity is increased. And there have been reports of Russia attempting or testing, if you want, you know, cyber warfare, particularly vis-a-vis Estonia. So I'm not for a moment suggesting that the concerns of the Baltics are outlandish. They have concerns, they're legitimate concerns. However, I think to extend that to trying to draw conclusions that there is a military threat, I think is a step maybe a bit too early. The second aspect is that a lot of this extrapolation that is taking place is based on Russian behavior in Ukraine. And the way Russia is treating Ukraine, it's assumed that that is how it will deal with all the spheres of influence. I am afraid that is a way too simplistic way of looking at things. I think that at least as far as Ukraine is concerned, the world has to come to certain acceptance of certain facts on the ground. One is that for the foreseeable future, and when I say foreseeable, I mean, for me, it's only 1 year, but for the more learned people, it's probably about 2 decades. So for the next 2 decades, at least, I definitely don't see the possibility of Crimea returning to Ukraine or to anyone else for that matter, irrespective of what regime exists in Russia. I mean, short of a complete collapse of Russia as an entity and even its territorial integrity, I do not see Crimea returning to, I don't see any leader capable of performing that task. That's point number one. Now, if that is an assumption that is accepted, then how do you deal with it? You see, you can either say that, oh no, unless Crimea is returned, let's then stop dealing with Russia on all issues. But then you run into the same problem. If trade has to increase, if business activities have to increase, suddenly you discover that that territory, which is so huge, unfortunately becomes a little indispensable. So I think personally, the more realistic approach is to do what the United States once did with the Baltics. They were part of the Soviet Union, but the United States refused to recognize it, and therefore they never visited it. Right? But that did not mean you didn't have the INF Treaty, you didn't have the START Treaty, you had several other cooperative and collaborative arrangements between the West and the United States. But that did not mean that the United States recognized the Baltics as part of the Soviet Union. So I think a similar approach and an emphasis on the implementation of the Minsk agreements, irrespective of what appears today as contradictory interpretations of it, I think is probably the way forward. The sanctions definitely are biting, definitely are creating problems for the Russians. But if you look at the Russian population and the way they are reacting, I mean, the Russian regime has successfully, in a sense, managed to control the PR exercise and the story that is sold to the people. And therefore, they have managed to use this as a means of increasing solidarity behind the government. And so far, they've been successful, although some of the internal issues unrelated to sanctions and all, for example, the pension reforms and other things are definitely lowering the authority of Mr. Putin and his regime. But I personally don't think that Russia is about to stumble, trip, fall. I mean, I think they may slow down a bit, but they will be there. Where does that put India? India has considered the Baltics always very important. The Baltics have been India's route, as it were, to the northern European countries. And I think even today, if you look at the INSTC, it really terminates in the Baltics. I mean, its logical, original thought was that it would terminate in the Baltics. And from there, the goods would be transported to the rest of Northern Europe. I think that economic interest continues. I also think that we have to start looking at this thanks to China's economic projects. I think we have to start looking at Eurasia as a single supercontinent, as a single landmass in which there is a clash of many interests. I think you have to look at India's desire not to see a hegemon emerge on this Eurasian landmass, and therefore, forgive me if I'm sort of being dramatic, but the final frontier of the clash to prevent such hegemony from emerging will probably be Europe. And Europe is currently, I think, waking up and realizing that there are dangers to unrestricted total trade with under the conditions that are being set up in the BRI. But the from an Indian perspective, the danger is not over. Coming back to and linking that to the final point is the Azov Sea incident. I have my own view on why it happened, and it does not coincide with, I think, most of the people at the table here. So I'm not going to get into that debate. But there is one element that I think is cautionary for India. India, before it jumps into taking a stand, or before it takes a stand, must very carefully, if at all it has to take a stand, must very carefully weigh and consider if there are any similarities between the Azov Sea and the South China Sea. If there are any similarities in the behavior of the two dominant powers. And because we have a particular position that we have on the South China Sea, and therefore we need to see that we are not in a position of contradiction when it comes to the Azov Sea. But as I said, I mean, going back to the original point, the Baltics have reasons to be concerned. The Baltics may require or want to exaggerate that fear at this point, but it's not that they don't have a basis for it. The Baltics are an important area for Russia. The Baltics are a very important area for India too. And we may end up, as Britta said, there appears to be a flux in Indo-Russian relations, but we may have one more area of difference of assessment with the Russians when it comes to the Baltics, but I don't think that that is going to be a tripping point in our relationship with Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nandan, also especially for opening up this perspective to the Eurasian landmass. I think while much of it, what we are seeing at the moment between Russia and Europe looks a little bit like a reload of the Cold War, the involvement of China as a new hegemon will probably be the game changer that we actually all do not really know how things will be developing, especially also on the European side, because it's a process that is just starting. But I don't want to stop the discussion here. Would you like to comment directly on what Nandan said, or shall we open the discussion? What do you think?
I can do both.
Okay, then let's do that. Please comment briefly on this. You would also like to? No? Okay. Then Andris, and after that we'll open.
It's even interesting because what I really enjoy what Nandan as well was saying, and of course it's always some dialectics, and I would agree with most of the points you made, even though I am not defending Russian interests, as you said at the beginning, or a little bit defend sort of how, not interest, but the Russian position in a sense. About the military threats, I would subscribe to this one. So I think there are no sort of direct, imminent military threats to the Baltic countries. Even though, of course, once more, I should sort of a little bit remind identity of the Central and East Europeans. And it is part of our identity, it's part of, you can say, our DNA in a sense. Speaking about the optimist and pessimist. So pessimist says that we have reached rock bottom. That's it. Optimist says, no, we can still go further. So in this regard, the Central and East Europeans are in a sense optimists that it can get worse always. So if you want a peace, be ready for the different negative scenarios. Even though, of course, as I agree, it's unlikely. If sometimes some asks me to compare, let's say, Crimea scenario, I say it's impossible because, or it's unlikely because there are in 3 cases or 3 elements should be there for, let us say, something like this repeat in the Baltic case. One is Putin must be mad, and he is not mad. He is very calculative man. At the same time, he is also emotional man. Let's also add that point. It's not just about calculation. It's also about the pride and emotion. So that's not unimportant sometimes. Second one, the Baltic countries should be failed states. We are not failed states. with all of the challenges. It's different from Ukraine, with all respect to Ukrainians, but to some extent, Mr. Putin was right when he said Russia is a destiny, Ukraine is a project. I think for many Ukrainian leaders, Ukraine has been a milking cow to some extent. And third one, of course, there should be some complete disagreement and dismantling of Western alliance, NATO and EU. And of course, this is still not the case, even though, again, there are some troubles. So that's why not sort of to be completely complacent about what has happened. It would be naive for us. Yeah. So I think we must take into account that one. Certainly there are some interests, and I think what is the most powerful Russian sort of instrument, as I would say, most powerful Russian export good, it's corruption. And it's a particular model of business and model of politics as well. And I think Russians, it's not always directly managed from Mr. Putin, but I think, of course, this interaction of interests in the region, post-Soviet elements are still present as well. And I think this, of course, creates some concerns, how they could be used, how they influence also resilience of the Baltic countries, sort of consolidation and strength of the Baltic countries as well. On correlation or spillover effect with Ukraine, I would agree there might not be direct, but at the same time, well, we had the same thing about Georgia, that Georgia is a very unique case and that's it. Then we came to Ukraine. So it means that there is also element of the tendency and trend. I am not saying that next are the Baltic countries, but it seems that there is a geopolitics of resentment, geopolitics of assertiveness, and it's not just about one isolated single incident. And I think Azov case is still a continuation of this element of or geopolitics of resentment, and you can say continuous tension and continuous, I would not say misunderstanding, continuous element of divergence of interests. And at the same time, what happens in Ukraine influences stability in the whole region. So I think it's not deniable that it influences the perceptions, mutual perceptions. Of course, now to speak about trust, it's very difficult. And of course, it influences generally the modus operandi, how we interact with each other. What else? Yeah, I think I stop here. I'm happy to hear that also Baltics are important for India. India is increasingly becoming important also for the Baltic countries. And that's why for us it's also very important to hear Indian voice and Indian perception on Russia. It makes us also to think how the picture is more wide and how it looks in a more global perspective. Because, of course, we would be happy to be sort of partners and friends with India as well. But here on Russia, we have some divergence of emphasis sometimes. Thank you.
Sintija.
Remark, I mean, sometimes after all these military actions, what is happening in the region, we like putting in a second line the attitude thing, but I think the attitude is very important, and actually I don't see that the Baltic states are exaggerating or overloading the thought about our security regarding Russia. Actually, we are asked to comment and asked to speak about that, so this is the outside willingness to know and to understand us. Of course, it is important to us, but I would like to highlight the attitude and the trust, because there is dialogue between the West and Russia, of course, but still the question is in a trust. If so many countries are really worrying about the Russia and its actions in the region, so we have to think that what is wrong with the attitude. Thank you.
The ring is open now. Please, if you have questions and comments, which I'm sure you have, please identify yourselves, and those who are sitting in the back, maybe you come to the front, or there are also these mics lying there. So you're first, and I will collect three, probably, the gentleman over there. If you could come here, or there are two mics lying there, if somebody can give it to. Yes, and Kabir? Yeah, okay, so the three of you. First the lady and gentleman and Kabir.
Good morning. Thank you so much for such a great presentation. I'm Shreya Devara. I'm the Baltics analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit. I actually have two questions on the political and the security dimensions between the Baltic states and Russia. I do agree that the direct security or military threat to the Baltics is not that imminent, thanks to NATO. But I also think that there are other security dimensions that are becoming increasingly important. For instance, financial security. Mr. Nandan, you said that Latvia used to be a laundromat, but if you look at the ABLV bank recently, that is a continuation of similar cases. Thankfully, because of the structure of deposits in Latvia, it did not affect the Latvian economy directly, because most of the it was primarily a non-resident bank. But I fear a similar instance, like for instance in Estonia, I fear that in, let's say, the medium term, it could actually affect the sort of investor sentiment for the Baltics, financial investor sentiment. So I would really like to hear, what you have to say about that. The second question I have is slightly more broader in terms of the political dimensions. Latvia has just gone to elections. I'm still awaiting for a government. Estonia is going to elections soon. Lithuania is going to go to election in 2020. I understand this is like a continuity of the Baltic-Russia relations are, as you said, it's the continuity of resentment in a certain way. Diplomatic relations are improving, yes, but they have ups and downs. I'm just wondering, do you think this would have any sort of effect on, the sort of governments that would come into power? Like Latvia is, Harmony did again come out on top, but the fact that there are all other, so-called ethnic Latvian parties would continue to keep it out of government. Like, I'm just trying to understand what's the outlook for that, because Russian minorities do make a significant proportion of the Baltics. The fact that Harmony consistently comes out on top, I mean, sort of concurs with that sort of fact. So what's the political outlook like in the medium term and the long term in these countries? Like, how do we see the political scenario playing out? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Madam, I am P.K. Sharma from this National Standards Body of India.
Why don't you come to the front, and then also your voice will be recorded. It would be better.
Thank you, madam. I am P.K. Sharma from this BIS, our National Standards Body of India. With this, just I want to have a factual opinion or view or decision from your side regarding the ongoing conflict going on with the Ukraine. So we also understand, though I'm not confirmed, that the other party has imposed some martial with Russia because they feel that this is a invasion, military invasion. So in my point of view, I want to lay stress whether it will not have an impact on Russian economy because of oil prices or something like that. And there is some meeting scheduled of G20 in the coming at Argentina. So it will not affect the derailing of the meeting of the Mr. Putin and the counterpart of US, as market is highly sensitive now. So I want to have my discussion with you on these two things. Thank you, madam.
Thank you. Yes, and Kabir.
Okay, my question is for the entire panel, so anyone can answer. It's more based on two sort of ideations or musings, I'm not sure what they are, that have come from the European Union recently. One is, of course, of some sort of idea of a cohesive single unit European Union military apparatus that sort of comes into play, which I think both both NATO and Russia will have pretty strong opinions about in one way or the other. And the second one is something that German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz said, I think yesterday or today, I'm not sure, but he suggested that France should give up its United Nations Security Council seat to the European Union. So I just your thoughts as from your part of the world.
Thank you. Maybe Mr. Sprūds starts, and then I can take over. Nandan also has something to say about that.
Okay. I think on would be a little bit cautious on calling Latvia as a laundromat. I would like a little bit to stop that sort of discourse. I think it's a little bit of exaggeration. Yes, of course, we have had some challenges. We have had some problems. We have had some cases. But I mean, even if you compare the foreign money in Latvian banks, it has been assessed in a sort of highest time, it has been less than 50%. So it's not Cyprus, it's not even Liechtenstein or Luxembourg or Switzerland. So basically, the foreign money has been, and which has come through the Latvian banks, has been quite limited. Yes, there have been few banks which have tried to take those risks. Yeah, and actually, sort of after they failed with those risks, they've been closed down. And it has not had influence, as you rightly said, on Latvian economy. It had sort of influence on Latvian economy in 2008, 2009, one of the biggest banks, which also was exposed to sort of Russian financial markets collapsed. But then it was a factor of a combination of factors which influenced why also we went into quite a big recession. Of course, there is, in a sense, always this question how to balance risks with opportunities. Because we are neighbor of Russia, sort of. It means that we will not build the fences and say, that's it, we will not have anything to deal, anything sort of in common with Russia. Of course, also financially, there are institutions which are willing to take, let us say, some risks to also to have opportunities. Back in the 1990s, there was even this, you can say, poster, you know, we speak Russian and we are closer than Switzerland. Come to the Baltic countries, because we can sort of be the gateway, financial gateway to the sort of global financial markets. So there are some elements of opportunities, but I would not overstate sort of the laundromat thesis. I think it's too much and too powerful. Second one, on new government. Of course, there are a couple of elements, and well, we are still waiting when Swedish government will be formed. They have few months even longer the government formation process than us. We just started in a sense, yeah. So, but it I think shows general problem in government formation and in political domain. As Francis Fukuyama, to speak already with my academic hat on, as Francis Fukuyama would say, it is a sort of identity tribalism what we experience right now. So the fragmentation of politics, it is actually the future. So we will have this problem, and also it is the case in Latvia. Of course, with some elements of populism as well, with anti-globalization element as well, or deglobalization sort of proponents as well. I think the important element in the context of our discussion, of course, about Russian minority. I think I can go on and on and on this, but just few things. One is there is no Russian minority in Latvia. There are Russian minorities in plural. Wide range of people with different ethnic backgrounds, speaking Russian, with different legal statuses. Still are people who are non-citizens of Latvia. It is a sort of political challenge, let's not deny it. The people who received citizenship automatically, the people also who went through naturalization. But if you look sort of this ethnic division, actually this election shows that ethnic division is decreasing. What do I mean by this? Harmony, which has won sort of elections, they receive less than 20% of the vote. Previous elections, it was 23, 24%. Previous elections, it was 30%. Ethnic mobilization or ethnic affiliation is not anymore the most important one. And that's why, of course, it's not even about the parties. Of course, also societies, there are some mutual resentment. Again, let's not deny that part. But if you look in Latvian context, and as one example, we have one of the highest, if not the highest, interethnic marriage rate in Europe. 30% are interethnic marriages. So we might have some political challenges sometimes, especially when we speak history narratives, but then we might fall in love with each other and we live next to each other. And basically, so if you look there are a lot of Russians within other parties, what we would to some extent superficially could define as Latvian parties, but they are not really Latvian parties, they are more or less ideological parties. Of course, there would be less Russians in Latvian Nationalist Party, but they received what? They received 12% of the vote. So that's why the picture is always, of course, more complex. On, I think, Russian economy, conflict in Ukraine, I think I would leave for Nandan, even though I always have this sort of feeling Russian economy, and I think here we have a sort of our understanding in common that Russia, of course, is not as strong as it claims, but it is not as weak as sometimes we think and as we would like to it be. I think it is quite sustainable with all its challenges, all its pension system reform. Let's not sort of say that Russia will collapse. I think it's not the case. Yeah, so I think Russia will manage its problems. It's a big country and quite self-sustainable, even though at the same time it has, of course, challenges, including what you mentioned about how to deal with the pension system, because it seems it's not sustainable, the previous pension system. On EU military, again, different approaches. I think in a Trump age, some kind of strategic autonomy is a normal thing that we have to take, or Europeans have to think how we sort of behave, how we act in the context when Donald Trump is saying that the European Union is as bad as China, just smaller one. And that basically NATO is obsolete. Of course, it is in a sense natural. So on the other hand, you can add to this that at the same time, Trump is asking commitments from European unions or from European countries, more contributions. So there is some, I would say, a little bit of political and strategic schizophrenia on both sides in a sense. Because of course we are very much interconnected and we would like to keep the transatlantic alliance united. That's why I would say at the moment all European army discussion, as actually one of my Russian colleagues sort of defined it, it's military Schengen for NATO troops. So of course it is additional contribution, it is making some things more clarified, it is sort of taking some additional responsibility, but at the same time still priority is a transatlantic unity and NATO troops and especially US troops and US presence in Europe. And I think it would be majority, even if French sometimes might have a little bit of dreams of strategic autonomy. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, maybe from my side, first about the Ukraine. Of course, I think from a European point of view, if everybody might be aware that Crimea will remain with the Russians, but as long as you don't accept it, what has happened now is a violation of international law. And the question whether Europe would accept the annexation of Crimea as permanent, I think is at the moment not the question. These are decisions that usually can only be made by countries or by a unity as the European Union when there are pretty much as peace among themselves. And at the moment, the European Union is in a state of turmoil. So the decision is very unlikely, I would say, as a solution of the Kashmir conflict at the moment. So this is not going to happen in the near or middle future. So I think, and as long as this is the case, this kind of confrontation will continue with all that is involved, sanctions and threats and all these little needles and pins that are going on between Europe and Russia. So that is my view. And regarding Kabir's question, well, I mean. The suggestion by the German finance minister, it is personally I find it is very unfortunate that at the moment this kind of arm twisting is going on between France and Germany, and especially this coming from Germany because in Germany, the whole idea of having a European army and this being pushed by Macron is seen as a way of securing French dominance in Europe, which I find extremely unfortunate. This is not the way we should go about what this French president has to offer. But what you see from this is that as much as Angela Merkel has formally accepted the offer to go forward in the direction of creating a common European army, it is very clear, not only for political reasons, but even more so for financial reasons, that whatever you create there will be nothing on that level that would secure European defense in an autonomous way without the Americans and without NATO. So that is out of reach at the moment. Personally, I think it's a good idea that this discussion is on the table now, but the dimension that it's taking at the moment, I personally find rather worrying. Nandan?
European army, good idea. Not going to happen for some time. But more than that, what worries me is that, it's a good thing actually that Europe is starting to talk about security, because I think Europe has a security role to play in the world, and it is not just, France, this thing. Second is, What worries me is the division between Germany and France, because I think the Franco-German alliance is what will be the core strength of the EU and will keep the EU going together. So any kind of friction and frisson between them is not a very good sign. The lack of European army, I mean, just as a note of caution, has not prevented Europe from taking military action. Libya is a classic case, you see. So therefore, I basically believe that Europe has to start looking at the world a little bit more through a security prism. To that extent, I welcome the Baltics and their position. And I personally think that Europe has a much larger security role to play in the world.
Yes, yes, please. You first. Some other remarks, questions, contributions? Yes, and then the Colonel. Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Nandan made a very interesting proposition of comparing the South China Sea with the Baltic. Okay, Azov Sea in particular. Yes, okay, that's fine. I think in general, yeah, okay. Sorry for the, yeah, that's right. That's more accurate. In the general sense, I think in the South China Sea, the countries which are pitted against China are not so comfortable as the Baltic republics because there is no collective security treaty. So that is a general remark that I want to make. But more specifically, China has been flouting international law in the South China Sea in terms of freedom of navigation and its historic rights and so on and so forth, UNCLOS in particular. And India has been very steadfast in saying that China must adhere to these international norms and kind of conduct. Now, in this context, I see a similar thing which has happened in Sea of Azov that day, because the Russians have detained the naval person, the Ukrainian naval person, which actually goes against the UNCLOS in terms of the sovereign immunity of warships. So I just want your comments on that. Anybody who can. Thank you.
Embassy, I don't know your name.
My name is Artem. I'm at the Russian embassy. Yeah, I think it's quite clear that we have some differences on these issues, but I think that it is very interesting and strange for me that when we talk about the relations between Russia and the Baltics, and the issue of Russian ethnic minority was just mentioned in passing, although that is one of the most crucial issues in our bilateral relations with the Baltic states. The very simple truth is that despite the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed more than 20 years ago, there are still people inside the Baltic states that have no citizenship. It is a gross violation of their human rights, and that we have a problem with. Another issue, of course, is the fact that Latvia, for example, is one of the countries that heavily restricts the Russian language and use by ethnic minorities, which is a violation of the UNESCO convention. And of course, the latest issue is the rise of neo-Nazism in Latvia. We know that people openly march with swastika and in the central cities of these Baltic states. And the fact that the United Nations condemn neo-Nazism, but European Union fails to see the human rights violations in the Baltic states is appalling. So that's, I think, what should be discussed when we talk about Russia and the Baltic states.
Colonel, you wanted to ask something? No? No? You, sorry, I don't, no. Okay, so then you would like to react to this? Yeah?
Should I react to this? Is there anything to react?
I don't know.
No, of course, yes, gladly. I think on a Russian embassy representative, two things. I think it's some kind of old textbook which is given to all embassy representatives just to go around and to, I guess, to present. This is one thing. Second thing is, I think there is no denies that also there is some sort of challenge and problems in Latvia and our Baltic side, absolutely. But I think this proves it's very difficult to engage in a dialogue when you come with accusations which actually completely out of any context. Neo-Nazis, one example, can you please give some source apart from a Russian TV, which I think is constructing it always in a very nice way. If you have any source, any evidence, please. I would be happy to see from this old textbook if you could be able to provide it. I think if we speak about a violation of human rights, again, this is, I think, the old accusation which exists for a long time. The OSCE in 1990s, there were some challenges, there were some problems. Back in the 1990s, OSCE existed in Latvia and also Estonia. A rollout. European Union, it was one of the conditions that you should solve, or both the countries should solve, the issue of minorities. If you speak about issue of minorities, citizenship, everyone can receive citizenship every next 5 minutes. If you would like, and you would live in Latvia, you can go for the citizenship next 5 minutes and you can pass exam and you can become a citizen of Latvia. About the language, in Latvian case, we have, I think, 10 or 11 minority schools. Yes, there are some, you can say, more trained on a high school level to learn also Latvian, but up to secondary school level, you can have your education in Russian or in other minority languages. So for me, to hear accusations of gross violation, which else country would speak about gross violation? Name another one. Western country, India, China, who would mention the same textbook, who would use the same textbook. This textbook is used, as I said, so already in routine way. On the neo-Nazis, well, I think it's even difficult to respond to this one. Apart from Russian TV, I guess you would not find anything else or anywhere else some sort of such kind of evidence or information. That's it. Thank you. And again, I think that sort of my general perception is if you want to have a dialogue, you have a dialogue. This is not a dialogue. These are mutual accusations, or this time your accusations with regard to Latvia, which completely are baseless. And then it's very difficult to have any dialogue or interaction. Thank you.
Nandan. Oh, you wanted to say something? No.
No, I'll inject a lighter note into the dispute between Russia and the Baltics. Artyom, it reminds me that I, in fact, quite agree that the plight of stateless people should be taken up. But I think Russia would do itself a great favor if it took up the plight of, it'll get more support, if it took up the plight of stateless people across the globe. Since 1971, there are a few million in this country too, but I have not heard the Russians express a single iota of concern about them.
Any other contributions, comments, questions? No.
We have been crystal clear.
Yes, absolutely, it seems.
There's that discussion, everything is clear, it seems.
So if that is not the case, I think we can close the session here. Some people agree to disagree, I guess, and we won't be able to solve these issues here this morning. I would like to thank all of you for coming here, for presenting your point of view, and thanks a lot.